Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to our next installment of Colonial Settlement in Early Colonial America. I'm Miss Jennifer Blank, and I will be your guide on this journey. Today, ladies and gentlemen, we are talking about the Middle Colonies, right? So we've we've had some overviews, right? And we've talked about the New England colonies. Now let's talk about the Middle. And then our last couple of installments will be about the Southern colonies. So this is for AP United States history. Without further ado, let's go. And we will start with the great state of New York, right? So let's talk about what was going on in New York. So I'm going to move my little camera guy right over here. Okay, so the Middle Colonies are also sometimes known as the Restoration Colonies. I'm not sure why that is, but you're free to Google that on your own. Okay, so here's a map, just like laying it out, and does give you some information on New England as well, but just to give you some context of where New England colonies are. Now, for New York specifically, I want you to take note. A lot of those Dutch settlements are in New York, right? You don't have a whole lot of English presence in New York at this point, but that's going to change. Okay, it's going to change. So the 1600s were a golden age for the Dutch, right? They were an economic powerhouse at this point, major commercial and naval power. Pretty much the only naval power that could rival Britain at this point, since the Spanish Armada was taken out in 1588. So at that point, you really have England versus the Netherlands, right? Or the Dutch, rather. So they challenged England directly on the seas because they wanted to cut in on some of that colonial lucrative action, right? They wanted to get some of those resources for themselves. So there were three major Anglo-Dutch wars that were fought during this time, and this complicated matters for England in being able to start settling, right, in earnest. This is why you don't get, like, a massive uptick in English settlement until after the 1650 on is where you get like huge increases of settlement and spreading out. In the East Indies, they were also a major colonial power, which accounted for their great wealth. New Netherlands was founded in the Hudson River area, which is New York, basically. So it was around this time frame, 1623 to 24. It was established by the Dutch West India Company. They wanted a quick profit for the fur trade, and if you don't remember what the Dutch West India Company was, I invite you to go back and look at previous lessons to learn about that. So, company doesn't really care that much about the colony. Like, they don't care. They're just like, make us money, and that's it. So Manhattan, which is, of course, New York City, was known as New Amsterdam. Okay, it wasn't New York at first. It was New Amsterdam. But and I've told some folks, some folks in class have asked me about the story. If you didn't catch that story, you're going to get a little bit of it today. So it was purchased originally by this company for pennies per acre. So I mean, when you think about Manhattan prices now, and you think about it was just pennies per acre, it makes you want to cry, right? I mean, so cheap. All right, so New Amsterdam Harbor was huge. Okay, the thing about New England you have to remember is that it was great for shipping because of its harbors. So I want you to imagine that, we have a coastline like here, right? In the Chesapeake, the coastline went down like this, right? So if you're a little ship, right, and you're trying to come up the coast, like if the coastline is here and you have a steady gradual decline, your ship stopped here, because if you try to go any further, you're going to get stuck. So you have to stop here and then get in little tiny boats and unload everything. New England's geography wasn't like that. So you could practically bring a ship, like here's the coast and here's the coast that go, underwater, right? So you could practically bring a ship right up to that coastline, and that allows for much easier trade. So these harbors were key, so important. Now, in New Amsterdam, at least initially, the company ran everything. They had no interest in religious toleration, free speech, or democracy, did not care about any of that. Make us money. Your job is to make money. Your job isn't to be free. Your job is to make money. So we don't care about any of that. So governors appointed by the company were very autocratic because, again, the one overarching goal was to make money. Move my camera guy over there. So religious dissenters against the Dutch Reformed Church, including Quakers, were persecuted. So anybody who was against the official religion of the Dutch was persecuted. This accounts for the later founding of Massachusetts, but I'm sorry, not Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, but we'll get to that. So local assembly with limited power made laws, but it was established only after repeated protests by colonists. And at that point, the company was like, oh, we're having all these problems. Let's just let them have a little local assembly to just shut them up so we can keep making the money, right? Because that's all they wanted. They wanted to make the money. So some characteristics of New Amsterdam. Here's an old school map of what it looked like, what is now New York City, right? It was very autocratic. There were these things called patroonships, which were basically feudal estates, so there was really not a whole lot of freedom. It was very cosmopolitan, though. So you had a very diverse population, lots of different languages, lots of different cultures. But that didn't mean that all those cultures could practice or exist in the way that they wanted to. You were there to make money. That was it. And if you did anything that got in the way of that, then you would have a problem with the aristocrats, the patroon people, that they would stop you. So we also have the Swedes that are breaking in there, not only the Dutch, but also the Swedish, right? So they had a golden age in the middle of the 1600s. So they had this small underfunded colony. It was called New Sweden, right? It was near New Netherland, but it was called New Sweden, right? So in 1655, the Dutch attacked New Sweden, right? And then they basically just conquered them because they surrounded them. They were stuck there. And that's what's called a siege, when you're like locked into where you are, and basically the attacking army just waits you out until you run out of resources. Everything gets so like polluted, like you don't know, what are you supposed to do with your sewage? What are you supposed to do with your trash? You're literally locked in this walled-in city. That's what a siege is. Where the outside, the attacking party just waits, because they can have supplies continue to be brought to them because they're not locked in one location, right? They're surrounding you and they just wait. So the fort fell after a bloodless siege. They just waited them out and they came out and surrendered, right? They didn't have to actually attack. New Sweden was then absorbed into New Netherland, right? And this is what we now know as the state of New York, right? So New Netherlands eventually becomes a British royal colony. This is how New York came to be. So Charles II, he granted that whole area to his brother, right, Duke of York, long before he actually controlled the area. And then his brother's like, so yeah, when can I like have that? And he's like, oh no. I need to go get it. So in 1664, he sends the soldiers. Dutch had no way to fight them off. He was forced to surrender without firing a single shot because there's no point. Like, you're going to lose. You have two options. You sell to us for almost nothing, or you die when we kill you and we take it anyway. So Stuyvesant's like, okay, why don't you just have it, So it was then renamed New York, and that is how New York gets its name. So now England has taken over the Atlantic powerhouse of the colonies, right? So they now control the entire Atlantic coast. That's huge. That is going to be huge going forward. All right, so this is the Duke of York's original charter, which actually included parts of Connecticut. You can see modern day state lines are superimposed, on this map, and you can see what was granted to the Duke. There was all that stuff in orange. Nice, right? It's good to be the Duke. All right, so here's there is some Dutch residue that exists in New York, so you do have some artistic and cultural influences that still exist. If you look at the New York City seal and you look at some of the architecture and some of the names, Harlem and Brooklyn, Dutch, right? Architecture, the Gambrel roof, that's Dutch, right? Some customs, Easter egg, Santa Claus waffles, all that stuff. Like, hey, that's some Dutch residue. So there you go. We can thank the Dutch for some of that stuff. Pennsylvania. I love Pennsylvania. Because William Penn, I like that guy. Like, well, you can't really like him because he's dead. But like, I like him. He's good. This is an interesting guy. So the Quakers were this interesting denomination, this interesting branch of Protestantism. They quaked during their very intense religious practice. They kind of like, kind of shook all over like that. They're very like, they were invested in their religious practices, right? So they offended religious and secular leaders in England, both of them, because of how they practiced. They refused to pay taxes to support the Church of England. They met without paid clergy. So because all Quakers were like equal in terms of the hierarchy within their religious beliefs. So there was no need to pay anyone specific because everybody was technically clergy. You were all practitioners, right? So they believed that everybody was children of God. And they said the upper classes can kiss our Quaker behinds because we're all children of God. What makes you any better? Because you have this like fancy title and those clothes? Like, No, like we're all children of God. You're no better than we are. So, of course, like people in England, where it's still very aristocratic, they did not take kindly to that. They kept their hats on. They didn't genuflect, right? They addressed all people as commoners, including the nobility and royalty. They were like, no, man, because we're, you know what? We're all children of God. We're all equal in the eyes of God. So you can take your titles and you can stick it. And they wouldn't take oaths, which is like a big no-no. You have to like swear oaths to things, and they wouldn't do it because they're like, that's a violation of our religion. They were pacifists also. They were against war and conflict. They're like, you want us to fight? They're like, no, we're not fighting because we don't believe in that. We're just not doing it. So they really weren't playing by the rules of English society. So the English were happy to get rid of them. So enter William Penn. So William Penn was an aristocratic Englishman, but he was a traitor to his class, quote unquote. He was very attracted to the Quaker faith and joined up. He embraced Quakerism after his military service, and he saw what transpired, right? So he became a Quaker, and he ended up receiving in 1681 a grant from the king to establish a colony. And the king owed his father a debt, and this was the settlement of that debt. So he named it Pennsylvania and created a Quaker colony, right? He sent out paid agents and advertised for settlers. And his pamphlets were honest about what you were going to encounter. Remember our discussion of indentured servitude, how it was lies. It was like, yeah, just come over, you serve for a couple of years, and then we give you this stuff. But they made you serve way longer than you should, and they worked you so hard, they hoped you died, so they never had to make good in the contract. Effectively, they lied. It was propaganda just to get you over there for some free labor. He didn't do that. He said, this is what it is, right? This is, if you're going to come with eyes wide open. Know what you're coming to, right? And basically, if you made it to Pennsylvania, you got land. It's like, if you can get here, I'll give you some free land. He's like, hey! So everybody's like, I'll take that risk because there's no way I'm ever going to get anything like that here in England. I'm going to take the risk. I may die trying, but if I make it, I'm going to be able to make it, you know? So this liberal land policy was very attractive. So, you know what I also like about Penn? He bought at a fair price at that. He didn't just take the land from the Indians, he signed treaties with the Indians. The Quakers went among the Indians unarmed because they were pacifists and they believed in nonviolence, right? So the Indians didn't see them as a threat. But then we have this problem because the non-Quakers start coming in. And those people had arms, and those people decided they wanted land from the Indians, and they would take it. They would fight with the Indians. So this was the problem. Like, Pennsylvania was good times. Everybody was getting along. The natives were happy. The Quakers were happy. Everybody was excited, and it was good times. But then these non-Quaker people came in and screwed it all up, right? So they treated the native peoples poorly. They undermined all the actions of the Quakers. And, of course, that... now you have, I mean, Pennsylvania survived, obviously, but unfortunately it did not survive in the way that William Penn wanted it to. So the government of Pennsylvania, certainly when William Penn started it, you had a representative assembly elected by landowners, but if you made it to Pennsylvania, you basically became a landowner. So if you were, as an immigrant, you were able to participate in this representative assembly, which is exciting. Non-tax supported church. Non-tax supported church. This is going to be important for the eventual founding of the United States government because we have no official religion, ladies and gentlemen. No tax dollars go to support churches. Separation of church and state, very important. Freedom of worship was guaranteed to all, Quaker or not. They were forced to deny right to vote and hold office to Catholics and Jews by the English government. This is not something that William Penn liked. He was not on board with this, but he didn't have much of a say. So Catholics and Jews were not allowed to vote or to hold public office. Death penalty was only for treason and murder. And that compared to like, you could, so capital crime means you can be put to death for it. So in Pennsylvania, there were 2 crimes you could die from. In England, there were 200. So, wow, pretty different. So Pennsylvania society, what's that all about? So it attracted many different people because of these various advantages. I mean, who wouldn't want to go to Pennsylvania? I mean, you're telling me you want to go to Winthrop's, like, laced up, patriarchal, we hate women and everybody who doesn't believe in God exactly the way we do. You want to go there instead of Pennsylvania? Like, come on, bro. Like, So you have religious misfits from other colonies who didn't fit in these other places that were so, just religiously strict. lots of different ethnic groups because the Quakers were open to all. There was no provision for military defense, however, and that can cause problems. No restrictions on immigration, no slavery. Pennsylvania has no slavery. William Penn was like, no, because that's not a Quaker belief. All are equal in the eyes of God, right? They did have these blue laws, right, which were interesting. These were against the following: stage plays, cards, dice, and excessive hilarity. Basically, if you're not being properly stoic, then you're not worshiping God properly. But this is an interesting contradiction. We have a society that gives its citizens economic opportunity, civil liberty, and religious freedom, but then you have these blue laws. Kind of funny. Connecticut still has some of them actually on the books. So let's look at some urban population growth in these cities. So below, you see Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston. Charleston is in South Carolina. Philadelphia is in Pennsylvania. New York, of course, is in New York State, and Boston is in Massachusetts. So you have like 4 different colonies to look at here. Pardon me, you got New England, Middle, and Southern represented. So Boston, you can see we have a big spike from 1700 about 1750, still going up, and it levels off. Right after 1700 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, you see a huge spike, which makes sense because William Penn founded it in 1681. Takes a little while to get the word out, so just after 1700, you get this huge spike that continues unabated into 1775. In Charleston, you do have an upswing, but it's not quite as stark, right? And then New York in red, where you have a big tick up just after 1700 as well. Not as steep as Pennsylvania, but steeper than Charleston in terms of population growth. All right, New Jersey. Let's take a look at New Jersey. So New Jersey is both Pennsylvania and New York's neighbor, right? So in 1664, aristocratic proprietors received the area from the Duke of York. So Duke of York was a nobleman, but he's like 1 step removed from the throne. Some people lower on the nobility hierarchy were able to receive a land grant for that area, and they founded New Jersey. Many New Englanders ended up moving to New Jersey, largely because they wore out the soil. The soil wasn't that great anyway. We talked about that in the economics of the New England colonies. It's not ideal for farming, and they over-farmed it, right? So they wore out the soil. They're like, well, we can't do much here. They moved to New Jersey, where the soil was actually much more fertile than New England's ever was. In 1674, West New Jersey was sold to the Quakers, which accounts for it becoming a part of Pennsylvania. And East New Jersey eventually also becomes acquired by the Quakers. In 1702, East and West New Jersey combined to New Jersey, and then that's the creation of one huge colony that gives you New Jersey. All right, but this is why Pennsylvania and New Jersey are so inextricably linked, because for a while there really wasn't much of a distinction between the two. Delaware, the first state. It's the first state to ratify, actually. But it's a tiny little state. Like, I don't know if you've ever driven on I-95 on the New Jersey Turnpike. You're in Delaware for like 10 seconds. Not 10, I'm exaggerating. It's like 5-6 minutes, right? But you really it's basically the Delaware Memorial Bridge, and you're out of Delaware. Now, if you go a different route called US 1, you wind up in Delaware for quite some time. But if you're going on 95, Delaware lasts like 10 minutes. Like, it's really not much of it's very tiny little state. So it was named after Lord Lauderdale. He was a very harsh military governor in Virginia. He was closely associated with Penn's colony. In 1703, they were granted their own assembly. They remained under the control of Pennsylvania until the American Revolution, and at that point, it breaks into its own state. But up until the American Revolution, it's part of Pennsylvania. So some ethnic groups. Let's look at and see the ethnicities that were floating about. So I want you to just pause the video, take a look. You can draw conclusions on your own about which populations came. You might want to consider why they came and why they were coming at this point. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that wraps up our video about the Middle Colonies. I hope you learned what you needed to, and I will see you in the next video for the Southern Colonies.